My sister broke our family's only rule. Now I have to pretend a monster is her. There was only one rule in my family's house: you never, ever raise your voice. It wasn't a rule we talked about. It was something we breathed, something woven into the very fabric of our home. It was the first and most important lesson. The punishment for breaking it was to be erased. My childhood was a tapestry of silence. Laughter was a sharp intake of breath, a hand clapped over the mouth. Anger was a tightening of the jaw, a venomous hiss that barely disturbed the air. Even joy was a quiet, guarded thing. The loudest sounds in our home were the groan of the old floorboards, the scrape of a fork on a ceramic plate, the soft, wet beat of our own hearts. At school, I was a different person. I'd yell and shout with the other kids, my voice raw and unfamiliar in my own throat. I'd spend as much time as I could at my friends' houses, soaking in the beautiful, chaotic noise of their lives. Their parents would argue in booming voices, their siblings would shriek with laughter, the television would blare. It was a symphony, and our home was a vacuum. My father, Soren, hated it. Any request for a sleepover was met with a glare that could curdle milk. I learned to ask my mother, Lyra, whose spine was made of softer stuff. She'd take my request to him, and I'd lie in bed, straining to hear the friction of their whispers through the wall. I couldn't make out the words, just the texture of them, his, a coarse rasp like sandpaper on bone, hers, a frantic, pleading rustle. Sometimes she won. I wish she hadn't. I wish my father had locked me in my room every single night. Hindsight is a cruel, pointless torment, but it's the only companion I have in the dark. It whispers to me of all the ways things could have been different. It reminds me that the past is a tomb, sealed and absolute. There were other oddities, of course, quiet dissonances in our silent world. In the hallway hung a sprawling, hand-painted family tree. Generations of my ancestors stared out from tiny portraits, and beneath each married couple were their children, always in pairs. But next to every set of two, there was a space. A blank spot, a carefully preserved void where a third name should have been. A shadow sibling for every generation. My mother would bring in too many groceries, an extra carton of milk, a single pomegranate that no one ever ate. Sometimes, when setting the table, her hands would move on autopilot, laying out a fifth plate, a fifth set of silverware. She'd catch herself, her breath hitching, and quietly put it all away again. The empty space at the table screamed louder than any voice ever could. The strangest incident involved my grandmother, Morwen. She visited only once in my memory, a woman carved from granite in disapproval. Her eyes, pale and sharp, swept over my sister, Elara, and me. She didn't smile. She turned to my father. "You kept both?" Her whisper was sharper than a shout. "Soren, I told you, this farce must end. Get it over with." My father's face went white. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her brittle wrist, and steered her into the kitchen. "Go outside," he hissed at us, not looking back. We heard their whispers escalate, a frantic, ugly sound. She left that night, a storm of fury in a black coat, and never returned. I didn't understand her words then. I just knew they were a threat. Elara was 2 years older than me, and as siblings do, we had our rivalries. She was the perfect one, the quiet one, the one who never tested the limits of our father's patience. I was the restless one, the one who craved the noise of the outside world. I wanted to one-up her, just once. My friend, Leo, gave me the idea. We were at his house, a glorious cacophony of video game explosions and his dad yelling at the TV. "You should totally scare her," he said, holding up a disgustingly realistic rubber snake. "Hide it in her bed. Record her scream. It'll be epic." The thrill of it was intoxicating. A perfect, normal, childish prank. I couldn't have friends over. The risk was too great, but I could bring a piece of their world into mine. That night, I smuggled the snake home in my backpack, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I waited until the house was asleep, until the silence was at its deepest and most absolute. I crept into Elara's room, the floorboards groaning under my feet like tormented souls. She was a still lump under her blankets. Carefully, I lifted the edge of her pillow and slipped the coiled, rubbery horror underneath. Then I hid in her closet, my phone's camera ready, a giddy, triumphant smile on my face. I didn't have to wait long. She rolled over, her hand searching for the cool side of the pillow. Her fingers brushed against the snake. Her gasp was sharp. Then came the scream. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical violation of our home. It shattered the silence into a million glittering shards. It was a primal, terrified shriek that went on, echoing off the walls that had only ever known whispers. For a split second, I felt a surge of victory. Then the world ended. The scream was cut short as Elara clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the rubber snake. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more profound than before. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. Footsteps thundered down the hall the first time I had ever heard my parents run. They burst into the room. Soren saw Elara trembling and the toy on her bed. A low, guttural curse escaped his lips, a sound of pure despair. Lyra simply sagged against the doorframe, her face a mask of utter devastation, her eyes already looking at the floor. That's when the new sound began. It started from directly beneath my feet. A soft skittering, tick-tick-tick, like an insect scrabbling inside the walls. But it wasn't in the walls, it was under us. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It became a gouging, a splintering of wood. It was the sound of something starving, something desperate to get in or out. The dark oak floorboards in the center of the room began to bow upwards, the varnish cracking. The house itself seemed to take a ragged breath. With a sound like a giant snapping a bone, the boards split. Splinters flew like shrapnel. A hole opened up in the floor, a maw of raw, splintered wood and absolute darkness. And then something crawled out. My father scooped Elara into his arms, but as he saw the thing fully emerge, he flinched back, setting her down. He took a single, shuffling step away from his daughter. He looked at the creature, then at Elara, and his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The words weren't angry or even afraid. They were just tired, resigned. The final words of a man who had lost a war he'd been fighting his whole life. The thing was small, no bigger than a raccoon, and it moved with a horrifying, lurching crawl. Its skin was a translucent, angry red, stretched so tight over its lumpy frame that it looked ready to burst. It was swollen, fetal, and glistening with some foul ichor. A thick, fleshy cord, like a rotted umbilical, was draped over its shoulder, coiling around its neck before plugging back into its own distended stomach. How could something so pathetic, so sickly, be so strong? Its head swiveled, and two flat, black eyes, like pits of tar, locked onto my sister. Instinct took over. I scrambled out of the closet and threw myself between them. It was the bravest and stupidest thing I have ever done. No. My mother shrieked, a raw, forbidden sound. Before anyone could move, the creature was on me. A slick, three-fingered hand seized my ankle. I felt no weight, no struggle, just an impossible, explosive force. It flung me across the room like a doll. My head connected with the wall, and the world dissolved into a smear of black stars. Lyra was there in an instant, pulling me up, her arms a cage, shielding me and holding me back at the same time. It was too late. I could only watch, dizzy and sick, as the thing scuttled to Elara. She didn't even have time to scream again. Her nails scraped 4 long furrows into the floorboards as it dragged her, impossibly fast, towards the hole. Her muffled cry was swallowed by the darkness. Silence again, for a heartbeat. Then, a new sound from below. A wet, tearing noise. The sickening snap of ligaments parting, of bone being broken and reset. It was a sound of deconstruction. And then, through it all, I heard her voice, faint and mangled, call out one last time. "Mom, Dad." Then, something else pulled itself back through the hole. The sight of it made me vomit, a hot splash of bile on the floor. It was bigger now. Wrong. It stood upright on 2 legs of uneven length, stumbling like a drunk. One of its arms was long and thin. the other short and thick, ending in a cluster of mismatched fingers. It was as if a cruel child had been playing with a box of bones, jamming them together in a crude mockery of a human form. Patches of Elara's dark brown hair were stapled to its swollen, crimson scalp, some clumps still slick with blood. Her teeth, her perfectly white teeth, were crammed into its pale, gray gums at jagged angles, like shards of glass and clay. But the eyes were the worst. They were her eyes, stolen. They were set unevenly in its bloated face, one higher than the other, and they still held the ghost of her final terror. They screamed with a betrayal and a horror that no longer belonged to her. The thing turned its head with a wet crackle. It opened its mouth, full of my sister's teeth, and a sound came out, a gurgling, joyful noise that tried to be her laugh. My father walked forward, his face a blank slate. He reached down and scooped the monstrous, stumbling thing up into his arms, cradling it as if it were a newborn, as if it were his daughter. "It's okay, Elara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Daddy's here." The rest of my childhood was a masterclass in pretending. We pretended the thing that slept in Elara's bed was my sister. We pretended the wet, clicking sounds it made were her words, that its grotesque, lopsided grin was her smile. We had family dinners where it would drop a fork and the metallic clatter would make us all flinch, but the creature would just issue that wet, gravelly laugh as it fumbled to pick it up with its mismatched hands. The punishments for being unkind to her were far worse than any punishment I'd ever received for being loud. My father would lock me in my room, where the silence I had once found comforting became a suffocating enemy, alive with the memory of what I had done. My mother would look at me with eyes full of pity and fear, as if I were a ghost haunting her home. They weren't my parents anymore. They were keepers. Wardens of a monster that wore my sister's face. I left the day I turned 16. I packed a bag in the dead of night and walked out of that silent, screaming house and never looked back. I built a new life from scratch, a life full of noise and light. I tell people my family died in a car crash. In a way, it's true. Now, only one thing gives me any peace. My parents call sometimes. Their voices are loud now, full of desperate pleading, of angry recriminations. They beg me to come home. They tell me I have a duty. They tell me my sister misses me. I will never go back. And I will never, ever have children of my own. I won't buy the extra groceries. I won't set the extra plate. I won't leave a blank space on the family tree. This ancient, hungry thing that lives under my family's floorboards can starve. The curse, the silence, the horror, it all ends with me.